You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Wednesday the 30th of May. British kidnap victim freed in Sudan. Firms unable to find jobs for the unemployed to quit £5 billion work scheme. Lagarde attacks Greece whilst laughing all the way to the bank. Half of abortions in UK given to women who already have children. Mugabe as United Nations leader for tourism. Al-Qaeda second in command is killed in Afghan airstrike. Turkish PM says abortions are like airstrikes on civilians. Thought for the day, is it just the BBC and misinformation? Finally, a man covered in blood staggering around near a canal. What happens next? UK news. A British kidnap victim freed in Sudan. The Foreign Office has announced that Patrick Noonan, a British aid worker in Sudan, has been released after 3 months' captivity. Noonan had been in the Sudan for almost 2 years, working for the World Food Programme, when he was taken from the streets of Nyla along with his Sudanese driver 3 months ago. The driver was released the same day. Over 40 humanitarian aid workers have been abducted in the Sudan since 2009. Firms unable to find jobs for the unemployed to quit £5 billion work scheme. Employment Minister Chris Grayling will warn today that he expects several firms to drop out altogether from the work programme in the coming months. Mr Grayling will acknowledge that contractors are finding it more challenging than expected to find jobs for the unemployed. He insists that the government's flagship scheme to help the unemployed is well on the way to getting 100,000 people back to work since it was launched. He also claims it is still early days and the job market difficult. The scheme has managed to place only 20% of its clients in its first year. If it is early days, then we are unlikely to see an end anytime soon. Half of abortions given to women already with children. In the UK, 1 in 14 girls revealed to have terminated a pregnancy, while repeat procedures rise by a third as abortion rates continue to rise. For the first time since abortion was legalised, mothers overtook childless women in the abortion race this year. The latest statistics show that 51% of the women electing an abortion had 1 child. At the same time, women having had previous abortions increased to 36%. Euronews. While still insisting that the Greeks pay off their taxes, Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, pays no tax at all on her earnings of £350,000 a year. Part of this is paid by British taxpayers as the UK contributes 4.5% of the IMF's resources. She also receives a further tax-free allowance package of £52,000. It is clear that Madame Lagarde has no time for the Greeks' problems and has been quoted as saying that the IMF's money will be better spent on African children than on people in Athens. She has provoked a furious backlash when she blamed Greece's dire economic state on citizens who are trying to escape tax all the time. People in glass houses should not throw stones, Madame Lagarde. World news. Mugabe as United Nations leader for tourism. The United Nations, with infinite wisdom and malice aforethought, have chosen the dictatorial Mugabe as the United Nations leader for tourism. Mugabe's Zimbabwe, along with Zambia, will play host to a holiday industry conference to be held at Victoria Falls this coming year. Kumbi Machembwa, a spokesman for the Movement of Democratic Change, said, "I can't see any justification for this man being an ambassador. An ambassador for what? The man has blood on his hands. Do they really want tourists to see these bloody hands?" A World at 8 reporter commented, "I can't resist saying it. The inmates are well and truly running the asylum." Al-Qaeda second in command dies in Afghan airstrike. Sakir al-Taifa, Al-Qaeda's #1 man in Afghanistan, was killed in an airstrike on Sunday. Sakir al-Taifi commanded foreign insurgents in attacks on NATO and Afghan forces. Turkish PM says abortions are like airstrikes on civilians. The Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan has sparked a furious response from women's rights activists after comparing abortions to botched airstrikes that last year killed scores of Kurdish civilians. Turkish law sanctions abortions within 10 weeks from conception, but Mr Erdogan has publicly voiced his opposition, comparing them to murder. Thought for the day. Our old enemies, the BBC, are at it again. Now, I personally do not hate Muslims or the Arab people. On the same hand, I have very little time for the Palestinians and their so-called fight, and I have no time at all for a religious conviction that openly wants Israel wiped off the face of the earth, as I believe fervently that everyone who is of differing cultures should have their own place on God's earth, and think even more so that the buggers should stay in them. Now you know where this World at 8 presenter is coming from: zero tolerance on everyone. But in the case of the latest worldwide attempt to shift power in the Middle East, namely to overthrow the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, the BBC have surely hit their lowest ploy, or maybe not. They are showing a picture, warning it could offend apparently, showing the carcasses of the children killed in Hula. It has come to light that this particular picture, taken by Marco Delore, was shot, if you will excuse the pun, in Iraq in 2003. Now let me get this story straight about the massacre in Hula. We know that the Assad regime has had terrible troubles with the fundamentalist protesters who turned into rebels after a few months, no doubt aided and abetted by Iran and various other now fundamentalist Islamic bodies. Now the Arab world especially does not put up with protests per se. It is not in their genes. If you live in an Arabic Muslim country, you do not protest, and up to the couple of years ago this has been the norm: no protests. Then we in the West decided that the then president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, should not handle his Kurdish protesters so harshly, and compiled a long list of do's and don'ts which finally culminated in invasion and death. The death knell for the Middle East started 50 years ago when we in the West refused to support the then Shah of Iran. Of course he had secret police and private armies. How would anyone control a country like that without them? The giant propaganda machine of the media was not in use then. Think about it. If Jimmy Carter had had the balls to support the regime his country previously backed, we would not have had 9/11, 7/7, Bali, Afghanistan, Iraq and more. Iran would not have developed nuclear weapons and the fundamentalist Islamic idiots to use them. We would have had relative peace in the Middle East and the rest of the world. It might also have been reflected in the massive immigration of the Muslim people to sunnier shores. Do excuse that pun. The United Dummies, my name for the United Nations, cannot wait to see Syria, which is a relatively westernised and peaceful country, go the way of Iraq, Libya and Egypt. And they and the Western media are going to fish up any and all old or new pickies to shock and awe us in Europe. Am I shocked or awed? No, afraid not. Sad though these deaths are, they are collateral damage in the Arab world where life is cheap. Now back to Syria. It has never been clear to me what the protesters were protesting about in the first place. They seem to have it fairly good. Of course it doesn't help that any time you see news shots from the rebels' side they are yelling Allahu Akbar when shooting off their missiles. Of course these people are after democracy, aren't they? Now, and I mean just if these rebels were using civilian houses as station for their mortars and rifles and firing from the top of them, with women and children below, then when firing back, government forces or sympathisers are not going to consider that and civilians are going to get hurt and killed. In one picture in a national it showed a young boy, face painted with Islamic fundamentalist colours I presume, actually participating in a large and violent demonstration shortly before the killings occurred in Hula. The paper intimated he had been amongst those killed. In this picture he wasn't alone. He was surrounded by many boys his own age, probably around 12 years old, and adults. I'm not saying their deaths were justified. No one can justify killing children. But I can understand that in this particular area of the world, where normal considerations one would hope are used in taming the population in the West are simply not used. We are viewing a Muslim Arab country from a Western perspective, and it simply doesn't work. United Dummies want to move in and effectively not fire a shot. This would mean the defending government forces would not be allowed to defend Assad and his regime, but the rebels would receive all the aid and sympathy of the West, and another Islamic fundamentalist country is born. Now, I am not privy to information that would reveal what the end game is for us all, Europe and the Middle East. Whether it is the bankers, the establishment or big business, I do not know. It could be a plot to render the Middle East totally unstable and therefore be wiped off the face of the earth, or the forerunner of a giant melting pot is organised throughout the Middle, the Far East and Africa, thus rendering Europe totally open and defenceless. That is yet another delightful option, but I do not know. Another thought is that by effectively leaving the Third World open to China, we'll be getting rid of yet another potential coloniser, after we have totally alienated America, which at the moment is the only thing between us and China. Also, I do not know. The possibilities are endless, interesting and all utterly depressing. What I do think is that there are many people who do not know, or I would hope so, because what is happening in the way of social engineering on a worldwide scale is frightening. It is frightening that so many British and Europeans simply choose to believe what they see and hear second-hand and edited. It is frightening when the Russians show the only unbiased view on the Middle East, whilst United Dummies and Chief Dummy Annan is sabre-rattling to such good effect. It must be frightening for the people of Israel to be stuck in the middle of what are frankly maniacal neighbours from hell, whilst having an immigration problem of their own. It must be frightening for President Assad to be so hated for doing so little by so many ignorant people. It is frightening to me that we, in this country, who have so many terrible problems to solve, are weeping over old pictures presented as new ones from a different country and time. It is frightening for me to watch even the ITV news, which is only slightly less biased, but not by a huge margin, on the so-called current events, most of which are totally banal and non-British. We will have to leave Assad to handle things himself, which in truth he has been doing. Our interference from the West is the last thing any Arab country wants or needs. They have their own culture to deal with. They have their own means, and if it means killing civilians, then that is what will happen. Cry over your own countries, Europe. All the problems Assad and others have are coming our way, courtesy of the European Union and massive immigration. We have enough problems in this country, my friends, apathy and ignorance being just one of them. We have now come to a time in the British National Party where we must all fight to get the name of the party into the open. We have a media ban for too long and must find a way out of it. I listened to a man last night at a meeting in the South East. He was not a BNP member but a supporter. He had heard us on the other side of the bar and came in. He was an ordinary man, had trouble admittedly reading and writing, but his heart was in the right place, and he said, "I didn't know you, the BNP, were coming here tonight, or I would have been here earlier. How can you have meetings that no one knows about?" And he has a point. I will speak about this at a later date, but we must acknowledge that publicity is the way forward for this party, but unlike the BBC it'll be the right facts. Or in the words of Jack Webb in the immortal TV series Dragnet, "Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts." And finally, police and paramedics were called out to reports of a man covered in blood and staggering close to a canal, only to find out he was filming a zombie movie. I quote, "PC Saxon and PC Winfield have attended the canal between Stanley Ferry and Eastmoor in company with ambulance to reports of a male covered in blood staggering around. Once they arrived they located a group of filmmakers in the last days of filming a zombie movie with some very realistic makeup on show. The film is being shot by Nicola Mortar, 31, of Barnsley, South Yorks, for Safe House Pictures UK, which she co-founded with partner Damien. She said the incident happened as around 30 actors and extras were made up as zombies on the last day of a 5-day shoot. She said the police were fine and laughed. However, it is the second time the police have been on set. The first was to check whether the filmmakers could use a stunt gun. Bless our bobbies. You would think in the Muslim grooming area of Wakefield they would have had more to do, wouldn't you? You have been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynn Mozar and I wish you all a very good night. Then we are unlikely to see an end any time soon. Half of abortions given to women already with children. In the UK, 1 in 14 girls revealed to have terminated a pregnancy, while repeat procedures rise by a third as abortion rates continue to rise. For the first time since abortion was legalised, mothers overtook childless women in the abortion race this year. The latest statistics show that 51% of the women electing an abortion had one child. At the same time, women having had previous abortions. Lagarde attacks Greece whilst laughing all the way to the bank. Half of abortions in the UK given to women who already have children. Mugabe as United Nations leader for tourism. Al-Qaeda second in command is killed in Afghan airstrike. Turkish PM says abortions are like airstrikes on civilians. Thought for the day, is it just the BBC and misinformation? Finally, a man covered in blood staggering around near a canal. What happens next? UK news. A British kidnap victim freed in Sudan. The Foreign Office has announced that Patrick Noonan, a British aid worker in Sudan, has been released after 3 months' captivity. Noonan had been in the Sudan for almost 2 years, working for the World Food Programme, when he was taken from the streets of Naila along with his Sudanese driver 3 months ago. The driver was released the same day. Over 40 humanitarian aid workers have been abducted in the Sudan since 2009. Firms unable to find jobs for the unemployed to quit $5 billion
You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, Wednesday the 30th of May. British kidnap victim freed in Sudan. Firms unable to find jobs for the unemployed to quit £5 billion work scheme. Employment Minister Chris Grayling will warn today that he expects several firms to drop out altogether from the work programme in the coming months. Mr Grayling will acknowledge that contractors are finding it more challenging than expected to find jobs for the unemployed. He insists that the government's flagship scheme to help the unemployed is well on the way to getting 100,000 people back to work since it was launched. He also claims it is still early days and the job market difficult. The scheme has managed to place only 20% of its clients in its first year. If it is early days,